On the cusp of the release of the Thousand Year Blood War Arc anime, I put it to you guys to decide who should be the topic of the next Bleach character analysis video between the two leaders of the opposing sides of the war. And you voted for the winner to be SHIGEKUNI GENRYUUSAI Yamamoto. One of the most ancient figures in Bleach, Yamamoto, the founder of the Gotei 13, and easily one of, if not the single strongest Shinigami in all of Bleach, is an absolutely fascinating character, and as a stalwart defender of the authority of Soul Society itself, it might not seem like he has that much going on in terms of depth from the outside, but as the series progresses, more and more is unraveled about this character until he becomes truly interesting by the end. Personally, what I like most about Yamamoto as a character, however, isn't even that depth that he acquires later on. It is the fact that he is this absolute perceived symbol of true authority and strength within the Soul Society. You only need to look at him to see the Soul Society within Yamamoto himself. He truly embodies everything it means really to be a Shinigami and to uphold the laws and the values of the Gotei that he founded. And that's just so awesome to see a character who is so truly symbolic of this massive organization. Part of what makes him such a mysterious character, part of what makes him seem so separate from everything else, is the fact that Yamamoto is used by Kubo fairly sparingly throughout the story, but that just helps to emphasize those moments where he does actually step foot onto the battlefield. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do have a Patreon for the channel as well. And to everyone who is supporting me over there on Patreon, as always, I just want to say a massive thank you to each and every one of you. I really do appreciate it. And as is always the case with my character analysis videos, there will be spoilers for the entire story of Bleach ahead. So where do you begin with a character like Yamamoto, who so truly encapsulates the history of Soul Society itself? That really does make him such an intriguing character compared to the rest of the cast, who feel like infants in comparison to this guy who has seen it all, who has been through it all, and who really does just know and understand this world perhaps better than nearly anybody else. Well, the best place to begin is with a character overview, and as always, we begin that by looking at his manga lifespan. Yamamoto was introduced in chapter 81, along with virtually every other captain of the Gotei 13, outside of those that we saw fleetingly before that moment, characters like Byakuya, Kenpachi, Gin. Yamamoto is introduced with the rest of them heading up this captain's meeting to kind of decide what to do about Gin after he failed to defeat and capture the Ryoka at the gate. And Yamamoto's final appearance is right the way through to 533. Though that is a ways away from the actual end of the series, only further highlighting kind of how little Yamamoto actually has to do in the grand scheme of things. And that's why, even though I do really enjoy this character, I actually have grown to like Yamamoto more and more over the years, rather than just seeing him as this badass old grandpa with a fantastic design and an even more awesome zanpakuto. I've actually grown to have a deeper enjoyment of this character rather than just a superfluous surface level love. What it is that I actually like most about this character is the fact that he carries the weight of the history, of the traditions, of the foundations of the Gotei 13 with him wherever he goes. As Aizen himself even says, if I kill you, it'll be like I am undoing the history of Soul Society. You carry the history of Soul Society with you, and for me, that's what I like most about this character, outside of everything else that makes him who he is. That's what I've always found to be the most interesting part of Yamamoto. And Yamamoto is, of course, a beacon of tradition. You know, you see that within himself, you see that within his first division, which is there to uphold the ideals of Soul Society and paint this exemplary picture of a Shinigami for the rest of the Gotei 13 to follow. Another thing I've always really liked about this character is that he obviously holds a lot of responsibility being the leader of the Gotei 13, of the Shinigami. And I think that he comes across as a really flawed character in many ways. You know, he's not divine, he's not perfect. Yes, he has nearly godlike strength in the form of his zanpakuto, Ryujin Jakka, which perhaps has the greatest destructive capability of any zanpakuto ever, and Yamamoto is a master of every other Shinigami combat art. But he is very, very flawed on a deeply personal and human level. You know, he has come from the most bloodthirsty of times. He has pulled himself out of that darkness, and the Gotei 13 was built on a foundation of blood, of thuggishness, of brutality, of criminality. And some of that still seeps through today. Like I said, Yamamoto is a deeply traditional man. You know, he never really eschews the party line, essentially. Soul Society and its laws are him. He lives and breathes them. Probably having written some of them himself, you have to imagine he's so entwined with the history of this world. And that leads him to be quite short-sighted, quite rigid, difficult to change. Now, change does happen with Yamamoto, and that's a big part of his character development, this idea of him mellowing out over time, allowing things to be slightly more fluid, slightly less rigid and stuck in place. But it is this stubbornness, this narrow-minded focus on an adherence to the laws that makes Yamamoto a compelling and flawed character, and I really do like that. I like knowing that this guy isn't perfect, that he makes some bad decisions, that on a personal level, on a personable level, it's difficult for people to kind of relate to him because you're not supposed to. He is supposed to be the boss, the leader, and I really do like that. I think it's really cool that Kubo just committed to that for this character. Because, you know, at the end of the day, it's not going to make him the most popular character in the series, but I think that Yamamoto is so perfectly suited to that leadership role for the majority of Bleach that he just completely encapsulates everything that makes the Captain Commander of the Gotei 13 a respectable role that really works. In fact, you can almost imagine Yamamoto as a literal statue that Kubo chisels at and chips away at over time, and more of the layers underneath are revealed, kind of the further into the story you actually go. And if we move on now to talk about Yamamoto's visual design, I mean, it is fantastic. Kubo has always been a master at crafting character designs, and you only have to take one look at Yamamoto to know that he has seen it all. The amount of battles that he has been through, that he has lived through, are etched into his very skin. The history of combat is written on Yamamoto's back, you know, with all of those scars that run across him, that glow orange when he activates his zanpakuto as his Reiatsu is flowing through him. It's so cool. He lives and breathes power itself, wisdom itself, and he just feels so ancient, and I think it's fantastic. I think he is a great looking character. Just this idea that you only have to look at him, to look at the way Kubo draws him, the way he draws Ryujin Jakka, this absolute tempest of torrential flame, to feel that power radiate off the page itself, that power that has lived through thousands and thousands of years of battles, it's so well handled as well, because everything Yamamoto does up until basically the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, feels like a breeze to him. Like he is unperturbed by basically everything. He basically isn't bothered by almost everything that kind of befalls him. And I think there are so many tiny details that Kubo just completely gets right with this character. You know, the fact that you just have to look at Yamamoto's face to understand how a situation is going, which I think is so very clever, that Yamamoto spends most of the time with his eyes essentially shut. And then if something slightly piques his interest, he might open one eye, and if he's really shocked about something, both eyes will be wide open. It's just really, really clever. It's small things like that, tiny details that go into making and building and crafting a character that really bring them to life. That is a part of Yamamoto's personality, that he is so weather-worn, you know, so tired of everything, that virtually any kind of challenge that comes to the Soul Society that might worry other captains, other officers, he is totally nonplussed by it for the most part, and you can see that etched into his face. Then, of course, you've got the massive flowing beard, the extremely long eyebrows, the fact that he wears his Hayori simply draped over his shoulders rather than actually wearing it physically, as if depicting the history of Soul Society sitting on his back, is so very awesome. And then, of course, you've got his zanpakuto most of the time concealed within his cane, which again is just this really great little detail. And it actually, interestingly, seems to connect him to the Zero Squad. Most of them have zanpakuto that actually take the form of something different. Of course, the major difference there is that Yamamoto has a traditional katana. It's simply hiding, it's concealed within his cane, whereas the Zero Squad all seem to have zanpakuto that actually are these other objects, but it's still a cool little detail nonetheless that really sets him apart from the rest of the Gotei. And of course his personality, well, it is pretty much exactly what you would expect, and it is for the most part unchanging over the course of Bleach, but it would be. Yamamoto has been around for so very long that these events aren't going to change his outward character that much, and I actually really appreciate the way Kubo went about this character's development, because it's not an easy task. Someone like Yamamoto, who has been around for so very long, who literally started the Gotei 13 and has seen enemies and wars come and go, is not going to outwardly change that much. You know, when the Lost Agent arc came around and we saw many of the younger Shinigami had changed their outfits, whereas the older Shinigami hadn't, that was a really clever and subtle way of showing us that even though they are captains, they still haven't cemented their place in the world yet. They aren't quite set in the ways they are going to walk for the rest of their life, whereas characters like Yamamoto change nothing about them because they've been through all of that centuries ago. So again, that sort of thing is really, really subtle, and so Yamamoto's personality as a result also isn't going to change too much. He still remains that same gruff, no-nonsense, badass guy who really only cares about upholding the law of Soul Society and doing their job as Shinigami, as protectors, ensuring that they are defending the world and doing the best they can when it comes to defeating their enemies, when it comes to upholding the peace and sanctity of the Soul Society itself. Now, of course, Yamamoto's personality does change. Kubo does chip away slightly at that statue. We see fractures and splinters emerging in it. Over time, Yamamoto does become more chilled out, essentially. It's really fascinating seeing that change happen slowly, seeing Yamamoto allowing people back into the Soul Society, the Vizards, Kisuke Urahara and Yoruichi Shihoin, these characters, while they don't rejoin the Soul Society, they are so clearly not exiled anymore. And it's changes like that that, you know, Yamamoto of old, the Central 46 of old. Yamamoto and the Central 46 to me have always seemed to very closely align. Even though the Central 46 technically supersedes Yamamoto, in many ways he almost feels like a voice of them, a voice of the law and the court of Soul Society itself. But I feel like over time they separate more and more. You know, the court and the Gotei separate more and more. The Gotei definitely becomes more forgiving, less stubborn, less quick to judge, less prejudice, I guess, and that is thanks to Yamamoto changing, coming into contact with characters like Ichigo Kurosaki, who helped to figuratively open Yamamoto's eyes to the fact that things can change, and sometimes change is needed, change is good, you know, bringing the Vizard captains back into the fold, despite the fact that not too long ago, in Shinigami terms especially, you considered them to be criminals. The Central 46 wanted them dead, treated like normal hollows. And now you've just let them back in, and there's no downside to that. You know, they are fully willing to be allies, they're powerful, and the Gotei 13's captaincy ranks are once again filled. So while you might be forgiven for thinking that Yamamoto really doesn't change that much over the course of the story, although I think his character development takes a dramatic turn in the Thousand Year Blood War, he does change, and that's kind of the beauty of how this character is handled and how Kubo knows how to handle these characters so very well. But Yamamoto's character development really just goes crazy in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, in my opinion, when he suddenly loses his closest confidant, in many cases one of his actual friends, Sasakibe, who is murdered at the hands of the Vandenreich, which is their declaration of war. And suddenly, Yamamoto, who has basically maintained a constant for over the last 1,000 years or so, has that world upended, has it shattered in the blink of an eye. And it goes to show that even the absolute strongest of Shinigami, the strongest pillars of the Soul Society, can be splintered, can have a crack appear when the enemy hits them in the right place, in the pressure point. And it's fascinating to me seeing those pressure points being applied to Yamamoto. The further into this arc we get, the more his stability and his leadership begins to crumble. He starts being questioned, outright challenged by Mayuri, and Yamamoto starts making bad decisions, and I think it's really, really fascinating to see, and of course it ultimately leads to his death. You know, it's the final point for Yamamoto. He wasn't going to make it out alive, especially when his mind had been completely taken over by the rage of old, the rage that the young Yamamoto used to thrive on, used to actually feed on that rage and be this terrifying warrior. This new Yamamoto who had settled into a much calmer world, a much nicer world, that rage ends up being the downfall of him. And since we're effectively talking about it anyway, we may as well move on to Yamamoto's role within the story of Bleach. Now, as the Captain Commander of the Gotei 13, Yamamoto, of course, has a role to play in every single major story arc, outside of literally the Agent of the Shinigami arc at the start, where the Gotei hadn't effectively been introduced yet. And like I said, as the symbolic figurehead, he mostly leaves it to everybody else in the Gotei 13 unless the situation grows truly dire or otherwise personal. One thing that I think is really intriguing about Yamamoto and the way he was portrayed by Kubo is that there is an element of time involved, that no matter how much time Kubo dedicated to Yamamoto, there would always be more to learn. That's how intricate this character actually is. You know, even though we do get some flashbacks for Yamamoto, we see him in Turn Back the Pendulum, we see him in Everything But the Rain, and he even gets a flashback where we see a quote-unquote younger version of Yama. That Yamamoto in that flashback is still older than virtually all the younger generation captains we have in the present day. So no matter how much time Kubo dedicated to this character, it would never have really been enough. There is so much history flowing through Yamamoto's veins. It would have been really intriguing, I think, to have seen a truly young version of this man, to see what that would actually look like, because even in the briefest of glimpses we get of the earliest days of the Gotei, when he founds it as this gang of criminals, he still looks pretty old at the end of the day. So there is so much untapped story here with Yamamoto, which adds to the mystique, but at the same time, you know, you just want to peek underneath. You know, you just want to see more of who this guy actually is. But I actually think when it comes to the ancient leader, the ancient founder of the Gotei, more mystery is actually beneficial. It really keeps up that allure, and it makes Yamamoto in many ways more than just a man. He's a legend. You know, he is a myth almost. There's so much to him that what you're seeing in the story of Bleach, you recognize is only the surface. You're only scratching the very surface of what is essentially a massive, just a hidden character underneath. Now, Yamamoto doesn't have the biggest role to play in the Soul Society arc. In fact, he doesn't really come into contact with the Ryoka at all. Obviously, Ichigo is taking on his major rivals like Byakuya and Zaraki in that arc, and Yamamoto is mostly left to the wayside. The first time we see him, he's called a meeting of the captains, which is of course the first time we get to see all of the captains together as well, to discuss Gin Ichimaru's punishment after Gin basically failed to kill the Ryoka when they turned up at the gate, and it actually seems like, if anything, he let them go. Yamamoto's design here is also kind of fascinating to me. He retains mostly the same look, but there's something older about him, there's something smaller and almost meeker about this character. His zanpakuto as well is absolutely massive, hanging off the back of his chair. And it's cool to see how, even in the Soul Society arc alone, he would evolve to become more like the Yamamoto we would eventually come to know. I have to say, Yamamoto, from an artistic standpoint as well, going back to his design, is a character who has a very detailed face. Obviously, you know, you have all of the creases, all of the wrinkles, all of the lines etched into him, all of the shadows that come with that. And as a result, this is a character who, in my opinion, vastly benefited from the advancements in Kubo's art over the years, to the point where there are some times in the Thousand Year Blood War where he just looks amazingly well drawn. Like, he looks so detailed. This is one of those characters who I think Kubo's skill can really shine through. As the conflict against Ichigo's friends escalates, Yamamoto gathers the captains once again and states that they are now in a wartime scenario and everyone is authorized to use their zanpakuto if necessary, and he wants to crush the Ryoka now with no more issues. We don't get to see Yamamoto again right until the third act of this arc, when they're about to execute Rukia. Yamamoto is the one spearheading the execution, of course. He's the one explaining how everything is going to go down. And you get an interesting moment of humanity for Yamamoto here, who so far has really only appeared as this mysterious leader of the Gotei 13, where he asks Rukia about, do you have any last words, any last requests? And she asks if her friends can be spared, the Ryoka can be spared, can they be allowed to leave? And Yamamoto says yes. Once this execution is over, we'll allow the Ryoka to leave unharmed. And there's a cool moment where Isane is like, that was cruel, why would he lie to Rukia about that? They're obviously not going to let Ichigo and the others go, they'll kill them as soon as she's dead. And Unohana, gets Yamamoto. I mean, I feel like it's pretty obvious what Yamamoto's doing, but it's nice that Unohana is the one who relays this, she understands how this man works, and she says, he's not being cruel, Isane, he's being compassionate. Although, yes, you're right, he doesn't intend to let them live. He's allowing Rukia to die with no regrets, no heaviness in her heart. Kubo leaves a little author's note in each of the volumes, and I remember one of them, I think it must be 19, although that's just me guessing, but it's whenever the Sokyoku is revealed. Kubo mentions how he once overheard some kids, I think, saying that the Sokyoku, the Firebird, was Yamamoto's Bankai, and how he thought he had to try harder because they had got it wrong. I really like that, and I remember thinking back in the day, reading that, I was like, what is Yamamoto's Bankai? Will we ever actually learn it? And of course, eventually we would. Of course, Yamamoto watches as Ichigo stops the execution, and then to his true shock and horror, he watches as his two surrogate sons, Kyoraku and Ukitake, arrive and actually destroy the Sokyoku. And obviously their relationship is a really fascinating one. Kyoraku and Ukitake are old in their own right as well, nowhere near as old as Yamamoto, of course, and he has always kind of seen them as his sons. He trained them up through the Shino Academy. They were the first captains from that academy, the first graduates of the academy to become captains, and so in many ways, Yamamoto was always so proud of them, but it's quite clear that despite walking the same path for the most part, they all have very different ideals, very different views of the world around them, and that kind of comes to a head in their inevitable battle, because once those two have effectively broken the law, Yamamoto shuts them down, stops them from escaping, and he's like, I can't allow you two to get off with a mere thrashing this time. What you've done is incredibly serious, and I expect you know that. The kind of cold ruthlessness of Yamamoto is really well showcased in this scene, and this is perhaps the area I think he changes the most. Here, it's difficult to know just how much Yamamoto does actually value the lives of his men. Of course, I guess if they toe the line, then they're all right by him, but the moment they break any kind of a law, it seems like they're for the chopping block as far as Yamamoto is concerned. Now, it's perhaps he was absolutely raging at the fact that Kyoraku and Ukitake had seemingly betrayed him, but when Renji is escaping, Yamamoto says something like, it's all right, he's just a vice captain, he's expendable. And that kind of cold, callous disregard for someone's life, even if they have broken the law, is definitely something that would change slightly for Yamamoto as the story went on. But I think this confrontation with Kyoraku and Ukitake really exposes Yamamoto for the stubborn old fool that he can be, and while he does project this image of pure power, pure overbearing, overwhelming, monstrous power, incalculable, basically imperceptible for most people, a height that no one else can reach. And again, you see that really well in this fight as well, when he's just waiting for them already. He's appeared in front of them, he got there before they did, he crushes Nanao with his spiritual pressure. While he does project that image, this fight also exposes him for the stubborn man that he can be, where he just doesn't want to listen to reason at all. Even though he himself says that Kyoraku was well known for having a skill for being able to see the truth of situations, and that Ukitake was a good and noble person who was always popular, always the centre of attention, despite knowing all of these virtues of the people he considered his sons, he will fight them regardless without even listening to what they have to say. He won't even let Kyoraku and Ukitake explain themselves. As far as he's concerned, they have gone against the Soul Society, and for that, they must pay. He won't even entertain their thoughts at all. And I feel like that's another element of Yamamoto that changes, that calms down a little bit, that simmers down, the further in the story goes. Now, I'm not saying people can openly challenge Yamamoto later on in the story, although they certainly do, and again, once you get to the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, Mayuri is like outright calling Yamamoto out and standing up for himself, which I always thought was such a great scene. But of course, the standout moment here is Yamamoto unleashing his ancient Shikai Ryujin Jakka with the command, reduce all creation to ash, which of course is just insanely badass, and the art in this sequence is truly phenomenal. Yamamoto's zanpakuto showcasing more outward power here than we have ever seen in the series, and in many ways would ever see moving forwards. It looks so phenomenal. You need only look upon Yamamoto draped in shadow as he wields this flaming blade, a massive lick of fire coming swooping off the end of it, trailing behind it as he moves his sword in an elegant motion, as though the flame itself were like a stream of water. You only have to look upon it to think, how many battles has this zanpakuto seen? How many enemies has it turned to ash with its power? And it's just so... I think one of the best things about Yamamoto and the way Kubo portrays him is you do get this sense of awe when you look upon this character, which I think is, of course, extremely effective. That's how you should feel when looking upon the founder of the Gotei 13. Kubo encapsulates that masterfully, I think. And of course, they then all clash, Yamamoto, Kyoraku, and Okitake. But the battle is ended prematurely when it's revealed that Aizen is in fact a traitor. But of course you see Yamamoto, and he hasn't taken a single hit really. He's up against two of the greatest swordsmen in all of Soul Society, acknowledged by Yamamoto himself, and they don't seem to even be able to put a scratch on him. As we move into the Arrancar arc, Yamamoto is of course preparing everyone for the inevitable battle against Aizen and his Arrancar. Over video, he talks with the Hitsugaya Advance team about Aizen's true motive and the fact that they've discovered it, and he allows Momo a chance to talk with Hitsugaya again, showing a Yamamoto who is now more personable, a Yamamoto who is slightly more... Although he himself isn't emotional in this scene, he is granting the requests of other officers, of these officers who are much lower in rank and prestige than he is allowing them a chance for emotion, for reprieve, and I think that's already showing you a Yamamoto who is slightly different to the one that was depicted in Soul Society as being nothing more than a stone-cold commander of the law. There are even the tiniest flashes of Yamamoto potentially being understanding with his subordinates. When Hitsugaya is visibly upset by the condition Momo finds herself in, you see Yamamoto quietly being like Captain Hitsugaya as if he wants to keep talking to him, but Hitsugaya ends the call. And again, that sort of thing is really cool, and it just brings Yamamoto down to everybody else's level ever so slightly. Not quite, but ever so slightly. However, once Orihime is kidnapped by the Arrancars, that old-style Yamamoto rears its head once again. He will not allow anybody to go and rescue her. Yamamoto is entertaining the idea that Orihime has gone to Wako Mundo of her own free will, no matter how ridiculous it might sound, and he basically shuts down not only Ichigo, but people like Renji and Rukia as well. Honestly, that whole sequence, I think it's actually kind of underrated. It's really, really awesome. These people who are, in their own way, challenging Yamamoto and his authority. Renji basically says, I understand, sir, I will go and get the traitor Orihime back from Wako Mundo, flashing Ichigo this kind of sly smirk as he does. Yamamoto turns around and he's like, no, you're not going. No one's going to rescue her. To which Rukia turns around and says, I cannot obey that order. And Yamamoto's like, I thought you would say that, which is why he has sent Byakuya and Kenpachi to go and get them in case of dissent. Basically, they're expecting the Hitsugaya Advance team to disagree with them, to turn against them. And I've always thought that's a really interesting scene, that nobody wants to adhere to what Yamamoto is saying at this point, so he's having to use enforcers eventually. He's having to get some muscle to go and bring everyone back so there's no trouble. Yamamoto is perfectly happy to leave Orihime to her fate in Wako Mundo if it's advantageous for them to do so, or perhaps more rightly disadvantageous for them to go and save her. However, it is later revealed that Yamamoto kind of had a plan working in the background all along. He was working with Urahara Kisuke, having enlisted him to ensure that they had a way for captains to go to and from Wako Mundo, and so with that option now up and running, Kisuke obviously knowing how to use Garganta, the captains invade Wako Mundo to help rescue Ichigo and his friends on Yamamoto's orders. So again, that's kind of interesting. It's basically effectively revealed that Yamamoto was always planning on invading Wako Mundo at some point. Orihime being taken didn't really factor into it at all. He was just waiting for a concrete means of being able to get there and get back out again. Yamamoto and the rest of the Gotei 13 all arrive in the fake Karakura town to confront Aizen. Of course, 110 years prior to the main story, we still see that Yamamoto still in charge. Of course, he's been in charge since the inception of the Gotei, essentially. Despite some weirdness surrounding that, Yamamoto actually, just to go back briefly, when he's talking about the Oken, I believe he mentions that the secret of the Oken has been passed down from Captain Commander to Captain Commander over the ages, but since he founded the Gotei 13, and according to him, no Shinigami stronger than him has been born in the last 1,000 years, we can assume that he is the only Captain Commander to have ever been in that position until later on. So maybe when he says that, he's just talking about that's the plan for the Oken. I don't really know. But regardless, he's of course still in charge back here. Sasakibe is still his vice captain, and Yamamoto appoints Kisuke Urahara the new captain of the 12th Division. Later, when Shinigami begin disappearing mysteriously, Yamamoto convenes an emergency meeting and sends an advanced team out to the location of the disappearances to try and figure out exactly what's going on. Back in the fake Karakura town, Yamamoto traps Aizen, Gin, and Tozen within his Jokaku Enjo. Again, as soon as this battle begins, a massive display of power from the Captain Commander himself, which always just looks so amazing as well. But with those three now kind of out of the picture for a little while at least, anyway, Yamamoto says they can focus on bringing down the Espada. Once the fights really get underway, Yamamoto steps in to rescue his men from Aion again. This is another moment for Yamamoto where I think it comes across that he has changed a little bit. Although he scolds Kira and the others, saying, you know, you should be ashamed of yourselves for having to force me onto the front line, he still does it regardless. He still steps in and saves them. And even when Kira turns to him and he starts apologizing profusely, Yamamoto's like, no, I don't want your apology. That's what's wrong. It's that mentality that's wrong. Instead, observe the enemy with me. And I always really liked that, because Yamamoto comes across here as not a super hard ass who doesn't think he should be getting involved, who thinks it's beneath him, but somebody who instead wants to build up his men to be able to take on challenges like this so he's not needed. That's the difference here. It's not a case of him thinking, this is beneath me. It's that he doesn't want to be needed, but he will step in and help regardless. And of course, that moment where he takes on Aion is awesome, because he just completely destroys this massive monstrosity that has so far been wiping out vice captains left, right, and center. Now, I think most captains would have been able to beat Aion probably with little issue, because Aion is just a mindless monster at the end of the day. The only reason he is defeating vice captains so easily is raw power. He is overpowering them, he is outspeeding them, he is catching them off guard. But any captain with a modicum of real experience would be able to deal with that, and of course Yamamoto is the utmost extreme. And it's really cool just seeing Aion flailing around mindlessly and without aim, without purpose, and Yamamoto taking advantage of that, using Nadagiri to just split Aion in two in one move. Really, really cool stuff. And then, of course, one of my favourite moments in the anime specifically is when Aion charges at Yamamoto, only half of his body left, to which point Yamamoto says, don't you know the meaning of the word stop, you child? And as he says, you child, he unsheaths his zanpakuto, releases his Shikai in one swift move, and just incinerates Aion in the blink of an eye. Really, really cool, just a great showcase of his power. And then the three Fraction of Harabel who summoned Aion attempt to attack Yamamoto almost in a blind fury, to which point he kind of commends them for coming after him with only one arm apiece, and he just incinerates them with a swing, an arc of his zanpakuto, and he says that he'll only lightly toast them as a result, but doing so critically injures them and takes them out of the fight completely. When the battle takes a turn for the worse, Yamamoto is genuinely surprised by the arrival of Shinji and the Vizards, and he attempts to broker something of a peace deal between them. Shinji goes and seeks out Yamamoto. They have a really cool chat where he's like, oh, okay, so can we consider you our allies for the time being? And the moment Shinji's like, no, there's this tiny panel of Yamamoto beginning to unsheath Ryujin Jakka, ready to fight if these guys turn out to be new enemies, which I think is just a really awesome moment. Once the rest of the captains fall, Yamamoto challenges Aizen himself, and we've done a video on this battle in the past, but it's a really cool moment where Yamamoto just kind of grabs Aizen's arm, immediately is able to deduce that he has the real Aizen in his grasp, and then prepares to kill him, along with himself and every other captain in the vicinity with his colossal ability Enetsu Jigoku, which basically summons pillars of flame from hell itself bursting out of the ground, completely covering virtually the entire scope of Karakura Town, and Yamamoto puts his life on the line here, basically saying, you know, everyone is prepared for this, they've all been prepared for this, I was using their defeats to build this technique, to get everything set up and ready, and to die, to exterminate great evil is of course the credo of the Soul Society. It's what it means to be a member of the Gotei 13. And that's Yamamoto, perhaps in the purest form, embodying his own mantra, embodying the values that he has imposed on the Gotei 13, that he has infused within the lifeblood of the Gotei 13 itself, what it really means to wear the Shihakusho, what it means to carry a zanpakuto, what it means to be a Shinigami and a warrior, is to protect those that cannot protect themselves from evil, even if it means costing you your own life. I do fleetingly wonder what the world of Bleach would have looked like if Yamamoto had successfully pulled off that attack. I mean, presumably Aizen would have died. I argue this in my video about their battle. The Hogyoku hasn't started to recognize his soul yet at this point, so can we assume that he's not immortal yet? So Aizen would be dead. Presumably Gin would be dead. He must be there somewhere. And then, like, every other captain outside of Byakuya, Kenpachi, no, Unohana's there, so she'd be dead as well, and Mayuri, they'd survive, but presumably basically every other Shinigami there would be killed by Inetsu Jigoku, so the Soul Society would be left incredibly leaderless for a while. In that situation, I think Byakuya would become Captain Commander, personally, but, you know, virtually all the Vizards would be dead. That would be a really interesting what-if scenario. I think the Vandenreich would probably attack the very next day. They wouldn't be able to believe their luck, to be honest. And yeah, that would be really, really weird to see, but pretty cool as well. But of course, Yamamoto's attack doesn't go off. Wonderweiss arrives. Aizen reveals that he has engineered Wonderweiss to personally be able to deal with Ryujin Jakka, but regardless, Yamamoto crushes him anyway, simply using his bare fists. But the explosion that Wonderweiss releases afterwards is enough to take Yamamoto out of the fight. And so in the end, Yamamoto did almost give his life to try and protect Karakura Town, even if it was inadvertently, which I thought was a neat little way of bringing it all full circle. But before Aizen can kill Yamamoto, Yamamoto grabs his ankle and unleashes an incantationless Hado 96. Doing so costs Yamamoto his arm, but by the time everything ends, by the time the war is over, Yamamoto has mostly returned to his normal, sprightly self, just now missing a limb. But he's chewing out captains like Kyoraku, Byakuya, and Zaraki for, again, not really understanding the traditional values of what it means to be a Shinigami, or at the very least, it is now Yamamoto who is outdated, which I think is really interesting. Yamamoto is, of course, just chastising them for having lost their Heiori. Kyoraku says, you know, he just sees it as a fashion statement. Byakuya says it's something that's cheap. And Zaraki says it's something that is a nuisance and gets in his way when he's fighting. This is a great scene. I've talked about it before. It's a wonderful moment that really shows the characterization of these three captains like that. Really fast, really clever. And Yamamoto explodes at them for not really understanding what it means to wear such a symbol. Ironically, though, Yamamoto's Heiori was definitely disintegrated by Wonderweiss's explosion. In fact, he loses his Heiori after Wonderweiss smacks him, so I don't really know where he's getting off talking about that. Yamamoto doesn't play a huge role in the Lost Agent arc, but this is perhaps where the changes to Yamamoto become the most evident. Not only has he allowed the Vizards to return to their positions within the Gotei 13, but he allows Kisuke Urahara to come back into the Soul Society to work with him, to reward Ichigo, to save Ichigo, to repay their debt to him. And I think that's really awesome. Yamamoto even says himself to allow our debt to Kurosaki Ichigo to lie would be doing a great disservice to him and would leave a stain on the reputation and the history of the Gotei 13 forevermore. So this shows a really honourable side to Yamamoto, but the fact that they are giving a human Shinigami powers again is obviously a really great, not only callback to the start of the series, but a nice way to show how far Yamamoto has come, and again to show that separation of law and Gotei 13 that is slowly happening. Kubo himself even brings attention to it when Ichigo says, I thought giving Shinigami powers to a human was a great crime, and Renji says, well, we didn't have a choice, it was the Captain Commander's order. So that sort of thing is really awesome. You see, you know, Yamamoto ordering everyone to pour their Reiatsu into this special sword that Kisuke has brought them to help give Ichigo his Shinigami powers back. Yamamoto says, in this hour, Ichigo saved us, we will now save him. And I think this idea that Yamamoto has mellowed out is only further emphasized when Ichigo arrives to reclaim Ginjo Kugo's body. Yamamoto doesn't immediately say absolutely not, he was a criminal. It's actually Soifon who comes out aghast, saying, what are you talking about? That was a criminal who murdered Shinigami. And it's Shinji who is more dealing with the personal side of things, saying, how can you forgive someone like that after he messed with your friends and family? And Yamamoto basically kind of looks at Ichigo and seemingly, maybe better than almost anyone else, understands that Ichigo has grown up to some degree, and he says, I think, am I right in saying you thought very carefully about those words? Basically saying that, he will grant Ichigo's request so long as Ichigo understands the ramifications and has really been thinking about everything he has wanted to say. And so as we arrive at the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, Yamamoto is confronted in his office by mysterious masked men who claim to be a part of a group called the Vandenreich, and they declare war on Yamamoto and the Soul Society as Sasakibe is impaled in Yamamoto's office. Sasakibe's death presents perhaps the biggest change for Yamamoto yet. It is a seismic moment for this character that totally changes him moving forward and effectively numbers his days. It basically sends Yamamoto into this spiraling descent where he starts to lose control of himself. Thousands and thousands of years of tradition, of leadership begin to crumble, begin to go out the window, as everything seems to collapse around Yamamoto as he is completely engulfed in grief, eventually leading to his demise. Yamamoto watches on as Sasakibe is cremated, solemnly saying, "Light the fire." One of the saddest panels we've ever seen in the series is just Yamamoto standing alone, looking surprisingly small as he looks down at the ground, one of his true friends in life having been brutally murdered in front of him. And it's a powerful, powerful moment. It's really great stuff for Yamamoto's character in general, because this is a character who, like I said, we've never really seen anything like this before. I don't want to go into too much detail here about Yamamoto's journey in the 1,000-Year Blood War, as I've done an entire video on his downfall, on everything that built up to his eventual defeat and demise, so make sure to go and check that video out. But Yamamoto's journey comes to a sorrowful end here in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, where this character who was once so proud, so powerful, so immovable, basically is kneecapped by Sasakibe's death and is never the same afterwards. We do get some really cool flashbacks for Yamamoto where, again, like I said, we never really see him as a young man, but he's definitely younger here. Now, this flashback must be a couple of 1,000 years old at least, easily one of the earliest time periods we've ever seen in Bleach, and it is really cool to get that small, tiniest of glimpses into Yamamoto's backstory like that. And again, I kind of wish we'd had more, but it is great to preserve that mystery around the character as well, to show the foundation of perhaps one of his most important relationships. And of course, the way Sasakibe is handled in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc is kind of weird. And I honestly want to do a video on that separately at some point in the future, but to get those small glimpses into Yamamoto's past was itself a blessing as well. I actually really want to do a video on Yamamoto and Sasakibe's relationship in the future, and I actually think I'll probably wait until after the anime has covered that as well, just in case there's anything new there to talk about. But I think it was really clever of Kubo to give Yamamoto this emotional crutch in the form of Sasakibe. Yes, perhaps it was a little bit late. It's very, very strange, I think, to posthumously give Sasakibe all of his development. This is not a character that Kubo cared about in any stretch of the imagination until after he was dead. And I think it was at this point where Kubo basically realised that not only could he use Sasakibe as an effective marker for the start of the war, because realistically people didn't care about this character, only people in-universe cared about him, but that makes him an ideal scapegoat. You show the villains are serious by having your first on-screen hero die, while not really having to suffer the wrath of the fans or having to upend the world you've built at all. But at the same time, it provides valuable development for Yamamoto, which is why it was smart to make Sasakibe that crutch for Yamamoto to lean on and then to knock it away from him, leaving him to stand emotionally on his own 2 feet, which I think was a very interesting turn of events for a character who up until this point has never really been that emotional, but quickly he begins to fall off the rails. Obviously they have shared thousands of years together. Sasakibe has always served under Yamamoto, even with numerous openings in the captaincy spots that he could have filled. This was a place that Sasakibe wanted to be at, and Yamamoto wanted him by his side as well, and the two of them have been a steadfast duo, the likes of which the Gotei has never really seen before, and wouldn't see again for a long time yet. During the Quincy's first invasion, Yamamoto kills Sternritter O'Driscoll Bursey, the man who murdered Sasakibe, just obliterating him in a single strike in a very satisfying moment, before challenging Yamamoto himself, wiping out another 3 Sternritter who attempt to jump him before the main battle begins. Of course, in this fight, Yamamoto uses his much anticipated Bankai Zanka no Tachi to great effect. Kubo gives us a really nice showing of Yamamoto's true power, spacing it out over the course of a few chapters, building and building this crescendo to Yamamoto's abilities as they get crazier and crazier as the fight goes on, eventually culminating in Yamamoto summoning an army of undead charred skeletons, the victims of Ryujin Jakka from times gone by, until of course it's revealed that it's all for nothing, as this isn't Yamamoto he's fighting at all, but Roidloid, one of the Sternritter who can take the form of somebody else, and the real Yamamoto arrives, steals Yamamoto's Bankai, and there's a great moment of quiet in the few seconds before Yamamoto is killed where he just looks tired. You know, he looks done. He's been beaten. I think he knows he's probably been bested. There's a moment of like reflection where I think he knows he's probably about to die. And there's nothing he can do. He's failed the Soul Society. Thousands and thousands of years of history and tradition and being a protector and a defender of those who couldn't defend themselves are about to come to a swift end. And of course Yamamoto is killed here in this battle, cut in half, and then has his entire body obliterated, as even at the edge of death, he dares to try and cling on. A nice reference, of course, to Yamamoto's volume poem in volume 45 about, die standing on your feet, and of course that's effectively exactly what happens. We're not actually quite done with Yamamoto, however, as he does appear a few chapters later in chapter 533 in the Everything But the Rain flashback, where 20 years prior to the main storyline, Isshin Shiba is called to a captain's meeting to present a report on his unauthorized journey into Karakura Town, where he eventually battled the mysterious Hollow White. He met the Quincy Masaki, and Isshin gives his report while leaving out all the details regarding Masaki herself, and Yamamoto reads it, and although he pardons Isshin, he suspects he might not have told him everything. When it comes to the Hell chapter, obviously Yamamoto is dead. However, if this chapter does materialize an arc further on down the line, it seems like Yamamoto could have a role to play, as it's revealed that every single captain-level Shinigami throughout history has been unknowingly sent to hell after their death, as the Shinigami have been performing a ritual designed to allow their Reiatsu to return to the soil, but instead they've actually been damning their colleagues, their comrades, their friends to an eternity in hell instead. And in hell, each of these captains has garnered a new title, and Yamamoto's is founder of the court guard. Alright, but that's it for the video on SHIGEKUNI GENRYUUSAI Yamamoto, the founder of the Gotei 13, and one of the most ancient and powerful characters in the entire series. What do you think of Yamamoto? Let me know in the comments down below. Do you like this character? Do you see him as just being a standoffish, unreasonable grump? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Personally, like I said, I've always quite enjoyed the character of Yamamoto on a superficial level, but more recently, I've grown to see him for really what he is, and he is this elusive mystery of a character of whom we've only peeled back a surface layer, but what's there is already quite fascinating. Alright guys, but make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and until next time, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.